Hi guys, it's Matt here from MCS-books, and today I am going to be doing a sort of review video, sort of wrap-up video, sort of opinion video, sort of discussion video. I'm not entirely sure what this video is going to be just yet, but I'm going to talk at you. I have some things I want to share, and we shall see where it goes. Now, I guess for this sort of video, a few points that I want to bring up, at least, are creativity and cultural analysis or culture studies, however you want to kind of define it, and then the way that creativity and culture kind of go hand in hand. And there will be some elements, I think, of feminism within that. I think probably one of the biggest reasons I wanted to make this video was because I'm still kind of in the headspace of an essay that I've just finished writing and submitted, in which I kind of discuss methodologies of cultural analysis and the implications of using them as sort of like art methods or as creative crafts. So within the essay I discussed three methodologies. I discussed the transcription of interviews, the act of having interviews, and then the use of photos within sort of creating ethnography. And they were all kind of bracketed by the idea of a project that I'm currently working on, in which I am creating almost like a collection of short stories based around a specific stimuli. Now, through collecting the sort of data for these short stories, I'm holding focus group interviews and one-on-one interviews, but I'm also doing a lot of ethnographic research. So that just means I'm looking online for stuff to do with the topic, specifically blogs and Instagram and YouTube videos. So I sort of take these, analyze them as cultural phenomenon, and then I'm trying to like collect them and create short stories out of them by experimenting with writing styles, whether it's stream of consciousness, literary fiction, academic text, non-fiction, explorations, etc., etc. So it's a very open-ended, sort of limitless experiment, I guess you could say, within the form of writing ethnographies. And it's something that, requires a lot of reflexivity. So in this essay that I've just finished writing, I was being very reflexive and highly critical of everything I was trying to say, because there are always good sides and bad sides to everything you can do, and when dealing with culture there are so many problems that could be faced, and you kind of have to sort of understand how you personally can navigate through these problems and why you can justify the choices that you take or make throughout them. So whilst I was doing this, I was kind of arguing for the use of creativity within academic institutions. So I was kind of linking sort of imagined worlds of fictional worlds within books, and how you can relate the position of the ethnographer to lots of different characters, and how you can kind of draw from these as sources of learning, but you can also draw from them as sources of inspiration in what you later produce, and you can kind of use them to sort of argue your position of using creative models. So within academia there's sort of a lot of distrust with literary forms, and there's kind of whole debate whether a work of fiction can actually be substantial enough to analyse and use as a cultural object. So specifically within anthropological fields, it's kind of very much a no-no. You just don't go in that area. You need explicit scientific fact to use as data and to work from, and I kind of just want to play and blur these boundaries and see what can be created from it, because I personally am not actually an anthropologist. A lot of my studies do take anthropology within, but it's not something that I particularly wish to encourage the purity of anthropology. So I don't count myself as an anthropologist. So I've just finished this essay, and I've kind of like got a lot of thoughts about it. I've said a lot of things, but there are a lot of like opposing thoughts that I've kind of put into it, and I don't particularly want to share with you everything I've come up with, because they're all works in development. However, I would like to take these thoughts that I have and discuss them through books that I have recently read, and whilst they didn't kind of inform my essay in the way that I thought they might do, they have informed a lot of my recent ideas. So the three books that I have finished, I think in the past week actually, they were all sort of a hangover read from February, in which I couldn't finish them within February, but I did definitely want to get to them. So the first one is A Thrice-Told Tale by Margery. The second one is Hot Milk by Deborah Levy. And the third one is Poems, Protest and a Dream by Juana Inés de la Cruz. So I finished reading all of them in a fairly short amount of time. You can tell they're not very thick books, so they were quite easy to get through and quite quick to get through. And out of them, there's 2 non-fiction, well, kind of, I don't know, I don't know what this one counts as, non-fiction or fiction. It's kind of got like a history, it's also a poetry collection, and it's got a play in it. So this is a interesting book. I gave this one 3 stars actually. And I gave this one 3 stars also, and this one is a literary text which I gave 2 stars. So how do these ideas that I discussed at the start of this video relate to these 3 books? Very interestingly actually, the Juana Inés collection I'm going to leave towards the end to discuss further. These 2, however, are I think quite directly related. A Thrice-Told tale, I've talked about it on my channel before, but what it is, it's a female anthropologist who went to Taiwan to study a particular community there, and then one event happened, which at the time that it happened, she wrote a short story, fictional retelling of it. And then she also has the field notes of the time that this event happened, which was directly taken, note format, at the scene of the event. And then 30 years later, she wrote an academic paper in which she kind of analysed the event from a more anthropological and academic point of view. Now, she's put these 3 writings in one collection, and she's sort of used it as a reflexive way to talk about feminist, postmodernist, anthropological writings and the possibilities for them. But, however, I do not agree with everything that she has to say. It must be considered that when she did her fieldwork, it was in the 60s, and it was more because she was the wife of an anthropologist than anything else. But this was very common at that time. She did become a very renowned anthropologist in her own right after this. Then this book and this collection is from the 90s. So I do have to kind of always be conscious of that, and not only has anthropology changed dramatically since the 90s, it does have a lot of similarities still, but the wider culture and the wider society, or the way that we consume cultural knowledge, has changed very dramatically. So my issue with Margery is that she is a very traditional anthropologist, and she is more concerned with the purity of anthropology as a strictly scientific study, which in some respects I can agree on, but it's that rigidity of that belief which kind of deters me from wanting to pursue the more scientific anthropology study. I feel that within social and cultural contexts, you need a lot more fluidity and a lot more space to explore and play, to learn, instead of the rigidity that kind of she's trying to vouch for. She's doing it with a very strict feminist agenda, and I don't agree with her feminist agenda. It's white feminism and white academic feminism, and it's not particularly where we are at now. However, in the 90s, she was considered quite a radical thinker, particularly her work from the 60s to the 90s. It was quite radical, it was quite extreme, but today it's kind of a little bit flimsy. She sort of discusses gender within the study of anthropology and the study of Chinese communities in particular, and yet everyone she ever sort of discusses and every anthropologist that she uses are very much white middle class anthropologists. The only time she mentions 2 Chinese anthropologists studying the Chinese culture, she actually dismisses them for getting the study of gender wrong, which I feel is probably wrong on her behalf, because then it just shows that she's only seeing it through her white Western idea. She does bring that up, how she is only viewing it through a Western perspective, but then she doesn't sort of investigate the problems with that, and she doesn't investigate the lack of intersectionality within that, and it made me very angry. So despite all this, let's get to the actual main core of this argument, in which she's trying to show the different ways of writing an ethnography, a different way of showing an anthropological study in the written word. Now, the first one, like I said, is a fictional retelling, and she makes it so very clear that it is fictional, it is not real, none of this happened, even though it's based on an event that did happen, And judging from her field notes that you then see later, a lot of the stuff that she writes is taken from stuff that's happened. So the level of fictionality is very grey. I guess you don't know, well, you can tell, like particularly the ending of it is a fictional ending and written with a particular literary device. However, the way that she reflects upon it as a form of presenting ethnography is horrible, considering this is something that I'm trying to advocate and trying to experiment with my own work. Her sort of take on it, it's just foul. She is vile with the language she uses. She makes a very clear separation between works of fiction as a literary text, as like books to consume and enjoy, and then she makes very clear a stark difference between an ethnography, a written account of something that happened, and the difference between them are so vast. And she's trying to talk about how, as a feminist doing anthropology, you need to be very accessible, yet the sort of ideas that she has kind of keeps it in this very elite, tight group of anthropologists only. And then she sort of dismisses fiction or literary writing as something for an even greater elite, but then at the same time as something so frivolous that nobody with any academic backing could get on board with, which again very much positions herself and separates herself from the masses at large and from anyone outside of the academic institution, which is something which anthropology specifically sucks at. The Institute of the Academy itself is something that has so many problems with accessibility and education for all. So to see her perpetuating these ideas very much disappointed me, and there's an example of a quote that I want to read out to you which demonstrates this. "When I was a girl growing up in a working class family, I read everything I could get my hands on, but I was particularly interested in novels about women. I read to find out about a life that I saw from a distance, but to which I had no access. I knew the stories were often phony, but I didn't care. I wanted to know how women in cities boarded streetcars, bought food, chose their friends, what they talked about, and so on. And I wanted to know from someone who was there, who had experienced it. I sometimes laughed at the plots, and sometimes I didn't understand them, but I hungered for the details they provided me on a life that seemed exotic and exciting." So here, she's obviously talking about how she got into fiction as a child, and it kind of represents also how she kind of got into anthropology. They say the interests are there, and it's the same sort of desire for knowing more about something that's not your own, which I completely understand, and I think which is something that inspires lots of people to study anthropology or cultural arts. However, she then goes on to say, "In time though, I gave up on novels. There was no longer enough new information to make up for all the boring stories. That, I fear, may be the ultimate fate of experimental ethnography." So then you kind of see how she believes that fiction is boring, doesn't give you anything, you cannot learn from it. She thinks of it as a frivolous activity to sort of just enjoy as a child, perhaps. But then, because you can't learn anything about it, it's not worthy of her time, which I think shows to show that she obviously read very few good books, and therefore she maybe got caught in this cycle where she believes that books and literature are something for the elite, which I can understand, because a lot of the times you get that, particularly with things like the Man Booker Prize. However, by saying this, she's actually distancing and positioning herself in a different form of elite group. She then goes on to later say, and I will quote this again if I can find it, and this is in the sort of final chapter. This is where she reflects on everything that she has said before and sort of analyses different topics. "The blurring line between readers and informants carries one set of responsibilities, but there is a new set of responsibilities to our audiences that seems to have eluded the postmodernist critics, although I am not the first to mention it. Experimental ethnography, so obscure that native speakers of English with a PhD in anthropology find it difficult to understand, is written for a small elite made up primarily of first-world academics with literary inclinations." This, I just rolled my eyes so much, because it goes to show that rather than sort of embracing or acknowledging, she is creating an us and them perspective, which is the most damaging perspective to have, especially when you're doing social sciences. By sort of ridiculing these first world academics with literary inclinations, She is forgetting that by saying that they're an elite actually shows her elitism and actually shows her sort of unwillingness and steadfastness in the elite that she has created. By positioning herself as a native speaker of English with a PhD in anthropology, goes to show how elite she herself is. That is like a bubble that very few people can actually get into these days. And I understand that what she's trying to say is if these people, if this little bubble, who she obviously deems are the most academically and intelligently inclined people, cannot understand experimental ethnography, then of course nobody else can. But what I would actually argue is that this experimental ethnography is so much more accessible to people who don't know the academic lingo, who don't know the academic form, and who can't get into this sort of academic essay. They are the people who would look for the experimental ethnography, because at the end of the day, it's a work of art. It's something that people, anybody, everyone can find something out of through their interpretation. So by saying that she can't understand it as a native speaker with a PhD actually goes to show how limiting that mindset that she has is. It goes to show that she can only accept one form of truth, and that is the form of the academic essay with rigorous scientific backing, which I find so destroying of so many possible aspirations of people who want to get into this sort of career. Now, I gave it 3 stars because there is a lot of good that she does say, and the exploration of feminism is, in some respects, very on topic still today, and the reflections that she does give when she's being fair and when she isn't sort of presenting herself as the superior other sort of is very engaging and very well written. However, again, I do just have problems with it. So it kind of makes me think about how could a work of fiction be sort of deemed as a more ethnographic recount of somebody's life. And of course, I had just finished reading Hot Milk by Deborah Levy. This is an interesting text because the main character in this book is an anthropologist who was in the middle of studying her PhD and had to give up in order to work and look after her mother. The main character is in a very interesting position of both privilege and academic rigor, yet also of being stuck in the body of a woman and being in a position where she kind of has to give up a privilege and has to do something which she doesn't want to do in order to sort of look after her mother and etc. etc. However, the presentation of this book I found very poor. It just felt like the author had done lots of different sort of Google searches, just taken the top answer and then somehow inserted it in. Everything was so heavy-handed and on the nose. You literally couldn't get past a passage without the author telling you at the end of that passage what that passage was meant to mean. And it was just drove me crazy. I kept on rolling my eyes. And considering the main character was in the middle of studying a PhD in anthropology, the main character is useless. And she keeps on talking about how she's doing her field study whilst the book is happening, but it's kind of not actually her field study, if that makes sense. However, she talks about what she could be doing her field studying. Well, she's noticed somebody's doing this certain thing. Oh, what an interesting field study for an anthropological PhD dissertation. However, she's not. The author just wants to make it look like she is to kind of get across a message. So this book needed so much more research put into it and so much more active research, not just passive Google searches then copied and pasted and added at the end of a passage. It's so drenched in symbolism, but in a way that isn't representative of the way that normal humans sort of use symbolism, I guess, especially within cultural symbols. The way symbolism is written in here is very much based off the sort of cultural inventory of the main character as a British woman who has a Greek father and therefore has this Greek heritage. But again, everything kind of relates to this so explicitly that it's designed more for British people who don't know anything about Greek culture or Spanish culture. There are some things which obviously anybody who's been to Mallorca or even to Ibiza for a party holiday or anything would know, and yet the author presents it as if it is new information and only the author knows. And it just drove me absolutely crazy having to read it page and page and page. So then I was thinking, this is perhaps the sort of text that Margery Wolf is sort of going against. And I can understand, like, you know, I feel very much against this book. Even to think of it without the anthropological aspect, think of it as a piece of work in its own right, as a form of literature, as a form of literary fiction, as a shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, that sort of book, I still don't think it's that good. because there's no space for the reader to explore the topics themselves. Everything is just handed to you on a plate very clearly. And I think in a way it's trying to be a little bit more like abstract, the kind of like, ooh, what does that mean? Ooh, what does that represent? And I think that could be why it was shortlisted for the Man Booker. However, I think if you actually put thought into it, like if it's meant to evoke thought, if you put that thought into it, you realise that it's just a case of sloppy writing. I actually thought this was a debut novel from Deborah Levy. It wasn't until I read the back in the author's bio that I discovered it wasn't. But she has written stage plays, and I do think that she could do well with writing for theatre. Like the way this whole book was written, oh my god, the sentence structure was the same for every single sentence, and it was so boring. However, as a stage play, I think that everything that she kind of then does in this book would translate well to the stage. Like the sort of explicit symbolism is what you need sometimes within dialogue on stage, because how else are you going to tell the audience, or how else are you going to show the audience what needs to be imagined? As a novel, it failed. So then I was kind of thinking, what could be done to make it more an ethnographic study? Because at the end of the day, there is potential to explore this dual identity of British citizens who have this extra heritage and yet kind of perhaps aren't given or provided the space to truly explore it. And it could be an ethnographic account of women understanding their place within this specific society and kind of understanding their own sexuality within that. It has the potential. Yet, and you know, Deborah Levy is not an ethnographer. She's not an anthropologist. She is an author, a writer, so she doesn't have to. But, you know, when she's talking about the main character having done like interviews or kind of learning about these sort of methods that anthropologists do to enact interviews and to get the best information out of your participants, well, why couldn't the author then actually do it herself? Because then she might learn how people actually talk rather than writing something that is so far from reality. And I think that's probably one of my biggest disappointments, is what I feel is the lack of research that actually went into this. I just feel like it's more an opinion piece, but a poorly written opinion piece. So Margery Wolf kind of talks about how with anthropological text and with academic text, you are certain of the validity of truth behind it. Let's not get into a discussion about truth, like that's a whole different story, but there's a specific scientific truth to an anthropological text which you innately trust the anthropologist to deliver. So then she says that you cannot get this level of truth or trustfulness from a literary writer because they might have just Googled it and not actually know anything about the topic. However, I would argue that by no means demonstrates that all authors cannot do it. I feel that had Deborah Levy perhaps actually, spent a little longer planning this book and had actually talked to people who had the sort of same identity or the same crises of persons that the main character in this book had, if she had actually taken the time to sort of look into Greek culture, Greek mythology and Greek folklore, but then also the culture of Spanish tourist towns and the way that they kind of make up and the way that they are formed with all these new different cultures within that. Had she actually gone to these places, had she actually sort of interviewed, had she actually taken real data that she then worked off and was inspired by, then I feel even as a book in itself, as just a book, as just a work of fiction, it would have given this book so much more meat and so much more body, and it would have been less forced down our throats what the author wanted us to think, and more actually true to how people interpret other people's actions and other people's words and how we interpret other people's cultures and sort of like attach ourselves to these ideas. That is something that this book could have done with. Now, I'm not saying that every author does need to do ethnographic practice in order to write a good book. Not at all. However, there are some elements to the act of researching that I feel the writer just has to really invest in order to write that sort of fiction. Unless, of course, they're writing about events that have happened to themselves, then it's a completely different story. It's because it does have a level of truthfulness for them. I feel bad for this book, not because perhaps I'm being more critical just because of this sort of mindset I'm currently in, but I feel bad but at the same time I don't feel bad because I feel like I would have given it the same rating. I don't think it was a well-written book or a well-researched book or a well-argued book. So what I would like to sort of do is find the middle ground between these books and sort of explore the possibilities. And I would love to, if I had the time and if I had the money and the resources, I'd love to actually sort of spend time with authors who, both established and new authors, to kind of see how they do their research and perhaps even explore other methods with them to sort of do research and to create a fiction which kind of like blurs the boundaries and makes accessible real people and human lives and human stories. But then, of course, fiction is fiction, and perhaps it should be left that way. I'm just trying to sort of imagine a sort of utopia world where everything I study is more accessible to more people, and I feel that fiction and works of literary merit are really great tools to do that, and I just feel they're so underappreciated by the academy and the institutes that I am within that I kind of want to really propose, like, yes, come on guys, let's do this, let's sort of break these boundaries, let's break these barriers, and let's try to move forwards in imagining ethnography and anthropology and the study of culture, the study of people, because at the end of the day, anybody can do it and everybody does it to an extent. But that's off topic. So how does this all relate to Juana Inés? Actually, the argument I think I've made in this video probably doesn't relate so much, but I would say I gave this collection 3 stars. Mostly because some of the poems I didn't quite understand, but I think that's because of the time that she wrote it and the sort of literary devices that she wrote it within the poetry are just something that you kind of have to like know about in order to get. So there's that, but the play was very enjoyable. There was some poems that I really enjoyed. There was a collection of poems actually in particular where I think it's just 8 lines or something, but they were just hilarious. And this woman is incredible. She gave a big middle finger up to sort of men a lot of times, and it was really enjoyable. However, I do feel that the editor of this book kind of wanted to keep it very much an historic account of Juana Inés and her work, and I feel that there needed to be a lot more discussion about the actual culture that she kind of lived in. And this goes back again, because they were doing a historical account, it's the sort of the science of history almost, that how do you tell something that happened without giving your own bias to it? But however, I feel with Juana Inés, you need to have a bias. You need to present her as a radical feminist figure in a time that kind of didn't really accept it. Yet the editor didn't do that. He just gave a very much like historical account of facts, and he sort of like lured like the possibility of her having lesbian relationships, but didn't want to, because of course, like, God forbid that a famous feminist figure is a lesbian too. Like, problems with this that could be fixed with the concepts that I was talking about could fix these 2 texts. Yes. I said a lot more than I actually thought I was going to say. I hope it made sense. I hope you kind of like was able to follow along, and I would love to hear your opinions about this, because of course these are still like thoughts that are forming in my mind. While I have very strong opinions, they're not solid opinions yet, because there's just still so much more for me to like read and to consider and put into perspective. So if you guys have thoughts, then let me know and let's get talking about it. You can always like this video if you enjoyed it, and if you haven't already, you can always subscribe, and I shall see you next time for another video. Bye bye.